This program is brought to you by Penguin Books and Penguin Classics, the publishers of Iola Leroy. This landmark account of the African-American experience during the Civil War and its aftermath was first published in 1892, and this novel by the great writer and activist Frances Harper tells the story of a young daughter of a wealthy Mississippi planter who travels to the north to attend school when it is discovered that she has Negro blood. Iola Leroy, available now from Penguin Classics.
Welcome back to Penguin Classics On Air.
Well, what are the great themes of the classics that you know, the books that you return to? Well, there are two themes, love and death. They're the great themes. Now, I'm not making this up, but it's just common, standard wisdom. There are other themes, but start with love and death. Think about the books that you know, and one way or another, they deal with love and death. Well, black people, in a way, didn't have the luxury or didn't feel that they had the luxury just to write a love story. It had to be a love story with some white man whooping your head, a love story showing that I, too, am intelligent, a love story defeating the growth of Jim Crow racism. That's a big burden to put on a literary artist, a big burden.
That's something that I've sort of been very interested in with respect to history and the different obligations that the writer has to put forward an idea that means something. And I wonder whether either of you think that this idea of protest literature in any way changes our aesthetic appreciation or the evaluation of this literature as it moves through the world. Certainly, in many contexts, and my background is in African literature where there were writers who were jailed. Your very good friend Wole Soyinka wrote a fantastic book called The Man Died about his time in a prison in Nigeria. The idea of writing against major political forces, the kinds that could kill you or break you, is a powerful one and is something that might not have been experienced by the folks who were writing novels of manners at this same time period.
Right.
If you look at the coexistence of European literature, the lost generation you hear about so much, in the run-up to World War II, people were experimenting with language formally. People were writing, wild poetry at the same time that the writers in the United States were, writing in a sort of more political fashion. So not only is this something that is an added burden for African American authors or authors in any sort of minority culture, I wonder to what extent that changes our reading of the quality of the book, whether or not it's something that you can sort of evaluate along the same terms as a work of literary merit, and whether the politics complicate or muddle or in some ways debase the quality of the literature.
I think that more often that has happened in our readings, and that's not to say that there's some works of, some writings that have been really felt the burden of having to represent politically such that they sacrifice the literary quality. But I think that more so than not, that's been the burden of the critic who has wanted to see the sociological and only the sociological and the political in African American literature. Mm-hmm. I think the best writing by African Americans, what we call classics, one of the great sort of accomplishments of so much of that writing is that it has borne witness to that history that we talked about, borne witness to a political reality in ways that are just aesthetically exquisite. Mm-hmm. So when I think about The Fire Next Time by James Baldwin, right, I am as thrilled by that as a piece of literature as I am by what he awakens in me politically. And that's just a very kind of, takes a very gifted, very special writer who can pull that off. And so for me, it becomes yet another way to evaluate the literary quality. How well can this person present this history, this political reality, without losing sight of the fact that he or she is also dealing with words and ideas and ultimately with something beautiful, with the aesthetic.
So it's an advantage.
Precisely.
To me it is.
Yeah. Well, or how far away from the subject. How many levels, how many layers of meaning can an author speak to simultaneously? Think of 100 Years of Solitude. Now, it's very political, but it's very mythic. It's, you wouldn't read it and say, this is primarily a political novel. It's not nobody calls it protest literature. And in fact, it gave birth to new ways of seeing for Toni Morrison. And he, in turn, was influenced by the way that William Faulkner wrote, and so was Toni Morrison. So Morrison meets up with Marquez through Faulkner in two kind of ways, sort of double layers of representation from Faulkner. But I think that one of the problems with black literature traditionally, to me, the political context has been so immediate. Like the Klan is outside the building. So people ain't got time to be talking about witches and reality and stuff. They say, God damn, we got to get out of here. They're trying to burn the place down. And that sense of immediacy is not good, not a good thing if you're trying to create great literature. Look, it's every novel's ostensibly about something, or every work of literature. Let's take Hamlet. If we had a student who wrote an essay, we were teaching Shakespeare, and we had a student who wrote an essay that said, well, this is a play about the orders of succession of princes in Denmark. You'd say, son, you should go to law school, because this is what it's ostensibly about, but it's not what it's about. Or Othello is a scathing indictment of strictures against interracial marriage in Elizabethan England. And you'd say, please, it's what else is it about? What else it's about? The layers of meaning. And sometimes I think in our literature, it doesn't get to those other layers of meaning because it's being pressed into political service. It does in the example, with our great writers like Zora Neale Hurston and Toni Morrison and James Baldwin, et cetera, et cetera. I once said to James Baldwin was a friend of mine. I took him up to Yale. We had invited him up to give the Richard Wright lecture because we had gotten the Richard Wright papers, and I wanted to get James Baldwin's. So I took him into the Beinecke Library, and I said, Baldwin famously owed Richard Wright a huge favor. Richard Wright wrote a letter of recommendation for the Rosenwald Fellowship. And I said, have you ever seen the letter that Richard Wright wrote for you? And he said, oh, no. And I said, well, if I could show it to you, would you give or sell us your papers? He goes, absolutely. So I take him down the Beinecke, and we get the letter. And it blows his mind. But I said to him, do you know that you are probably taught more or excerpted more in rhetorics, in textbooks teaching the art of the essay than you are in African American literature anthologies. And by this time, it was certainly true. And he looked at me and said, is that true? And I said, I'm sure it's true. And I said, and the further we get away from the civil rights movement and the immediacy of the things that you wrote about, the more you'll be anthologized for your acts of writing rather than for the content of the writing. And he just looked puzzled, and I said, and I think that's a good thing. And after a long time, he said, I think that's a good thing as well.
You're listening to Penguin Classics on Air.